In the Myth of Sisyphus, I confront the absurdity of existence. The absurd arises from the conflict between our human desire for meaning and the indifferent silence of the universe. I argue that suicide is not the answer to the absurd, but rather revolt. Revolt is the act of affirming our humanity in the face of meaninglessness. I use the myth of Sisyphus to illustrate the absurd life. Sisyphus was a Greek king who was punished by the gods for his trickery. He was condemned to push a boulder up a hill for all eternity, only to have it roll back down again as soon as it reached the top. Sisyphus's punishment is futile and endless, but he continues to push the boulder nonetheless. I see Sisyphus as a figure of defiance and courage. He is aware of the absurdity of his situation, but he chooses to live anyway. He rebels against the gods and their meaningless punishment. I argue that we can all learn from Sisyphus. We can all live our lives in revolt against the absurd. We can do this by embracing our humanity, living authentically, and finding joy in the simple things in life. Here are some specific examples of how I argue in the myth of Sisyphus. I begin by establishing the absurd. I argue that the absurd arises from the conflict between our human desire for meaning and the indifferent silence of the universe. I write, the absurd is born of this confrontation between the human need and the unreasonable silence of the world. I then consider the consequences of the absurd. I argue that the absurd can lead to suicide, but that suicide is not the answer. I write, living is absurd and suicide is absurd. When it comes to the absurd, there is only one thing to do: to keep pushing. I introduce the concept of revolt. I argue that revolt is the act of affirming our humanity in the face of meaninglessness. I write, revolt will give life its value. I then discuss the different ways in which we can live our lives in revolt. I argue that we can rebel against the absurd by embracing our humanity, living authentically, and finding joy in the simple things in life. I write, we must live with passion and absurdity. I conclude the myth of Sisyphus by affirming the value of life, even in the face of the absurd. I write, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. I hope this overview of the myth of Sisyphus is helpful. I encourage you to read the essay in its entirety for a more in-depth understanding of my philosophy of the absurd.